My name is Elias Thorne, and for 52 years, the heart of my life was a secret I kept in a barn in Gallatin County, Montana. You hear stories, whispers on the wind about creatures in the woods, but my story isn't a whisper. It's a confession. I'm telling you this now because the weight of it is too much to carry alone into the grave. I sheltered a family of Sasquatch on my property. From the year I buried my father until the day the federal government pointed their satellites at my home. And I need you to hear what Homeland Security did when they finally cornered us, because that's the truth that's been crushing my chest ever since. It's a truth that explains why they hide, and it has nothing to do with being afraid of hunters or cameras. It's about what we are and what they know we are capable of becoming. So please, listen. Listen to the whole thing. It's the only proof I have left, and it's the only way this story will survive me. This isn't a tall tale. It's a final accounting of a promise I made in the dead of winter. A promise to a monster that turned out to be more human than most men I've known. It all started in the winter of '71. I was just 20 years old, and my father had just been put in the ground. The farm wasn't a home anymore. It was a weight of silence and responsibility that pressed down on my shoulders, cold and heavy like the Montana snow. My entire world had shrunk to the rhythmic squeak of my worn leather boots on the packed snow, the low groan of the wind moving through the dark pines at the edge of the property, and the steady, lonely clank of the well pump. Grief wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical thing. A constant hollowness in my gut that the cold seemed to seep into. Everything was routine, everything was numb. I'd chop wood until my hands were raw, mend fences until my back ached. Anything to fill the silence my father's absence had left behind. The silence was the real enemy back then, a vast, empty thing that swallowed every other sound. But that night, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy. It was wrong. And that's a feeling you learn to trust out here. The first sign was the quiet. The coyotes, who usually yipped and howled in the hills after sundown, were dead silent. Not a single call. Even the wind, which was a constant companion on that ridge, seemed to hold its breath. It was a listening silence, the kind that comes right before the crack of a lightning strike or the snap of a predator's jaws. My skin prickled with it. Then came the sound from the old barn. The one place that still smelled like him, like hay and work and safety. It wasn't the sound of a cow or a horse shifting its weight. It was a low, guttural tearing sound. A sharp, metallic rip, followed immediately by a soft, pained chuffing noise that sounded like a huge animal trying not to cry out. It was a sound of pure agony, and it cut right through the cold, still air, and straight into that hollow place in my chest. Something was in my barn. Something was hurt. And whatever it was big. I stood there on the porch for a long moment, the cold seeping through my socks, my own breath pluming in the air like a ghost. My first instinct was fear, plain and simple. But the second was something else. It was my father's voice in my head, clear as a bell. You don't let a thing suffer on your land, son. You either help it or you put it out of its misery. So I went back inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. I took his old .30-06 rifle from the rack by the door. The wood of the stock was smooth and cool in my trembling hands. I grabbed the heavy maglite from the kitchen drawer, its metal casing cold enough to sting. The beam cut a perfect, bright cone through the freezing night air as I walked toward the barn, my boots making no sound in the fresh powder. Every step felt like a drumbeat. The barn door was slightly ajar, a blacker slice of darkness against the night. The sound from within had stopped. It was just silence again. But now it was the watching, waiting kind. The kind of silence that has teeth. I put my shoulder to the heavy wood and pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, the rifle held tight against my chest. The air inside the barn hit me first. The familiar comfort of hay and cold earth was there, but it was mixed with something else. Something wild and musky, like damp soil and wet fur. And blood. The sharp, coppery tang of it. My light swept across the cavernous space, catching dust motes dancing in the beam. It passed over the empty cattle stalls, the stacked bales of hay reaching up into the rafters like silent, blocky giants. And then the beam found it. Huddled in the far corner, half hidden behind the old tractor, was a young one. It had to be. It was maybe 7 feet tall, even crouched down as it was, and covered from head to foot in dark. Matted hair the color of pine bark, its whole body was shaking, and it was desperately trying to pull a mangled steel trap off its lower leg, one of my father's old coyote traps. It was rusted and cruel, and its teeth were sunk deep into the creature's flesh. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a monster. It was a kid, terrified and in pain. And it was looking right at me. Its eyes locked onto mine. That's the part that I can never, ever forget. They weren't the simple, flat eyes of an animal. They were ancient and impossibly intelligent, dark pools that held a universe of fear, pain, and a shocking awareness. In that single, frozen moment, I saw my own reflection in them, a young man holding a rifle, a threat. The creature stopped pulling at the trap. It just watched me, its breath coming in ragged, chuffing pants. It didn't growl, it didn't roar or show its teeth. It just held my gaze. And I felt like it was looking straight through my skin and into that grieving, hollow part of me. I could see the muscles in its shoulders tensed, ready to fight or to flee, but the trap held it fast. It was completely at my mercy. I was the one with the power, the weapon, the choice, and in its eyes, I could see it knew that, too. The silence in the barn was absolute, broken only by the sound of its breathing and the frantic pounding of my own heart. A life, a secret, a whole world balanced on that moment. I could have shot it. Every sensible part of my brain screamed at me to do it. It was an unknown, a potential threat. No one would ever know. I could have just ended it, right there. Or I could have run, slammed the barn door shut, called the sheriff, and let the world deal with it. That would have been the safe thing to do, the logical thing. I pictured the headlines, the scientists, the circus that would descend on my quiet, grieving life. I pictured them putting it in a cage, but all I could see were those eyes, the eyes of something that was more than just a beast. I saw a child, trapped and terrified, on my land, in my barn, and I heard my father's voice again, softer this time. You don't let a thing suffer. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in my hands. It wasn't a tool for protection anymore. It felt like an instrument of cruelty. This creature hadn't threatened me. It had stumbled into a trap that I had failed to clear from the property. In a way, its pain was my fault. That was the first choice, right there. A promise made without a single word. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered the rifle. I heard the soft click as I put the safety back on. I leaned it against the wall, the sound of the woodstock bumping against the barn siding echoing in the stillness. The creature watched my every move, its dark eyes wide. It flinched when the rifle made contact with the wall, but it didn't look away from my face. I took a slow step back, raising my empty hands, palms out, the way you do with a spooked horse. I didn't say a word. What was there to say? I just stood there, letting it see I wasn't a threat. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, it let out a low, soft sound, a quiet rumble, deep in its chest. It wasn't a growl, it was a question. I gave a slow, single nod. Then I backed out of the barn as carefully as I had come in, pulling the heavy door almost shut, but leaving it open just a crack. My heart was still hammering, but the fear was gone. It had been replaced by something new, something heavy and profound. A responsibility I had just accepted without fully understanding it. I went back to the farmhouse, my mind reeling. I didn't even think. I just acted. I ladled a generous portion of the beef stew I'd made for my own dinner into a big metal bowl. It was thick with potatoes and carrots, still warm. I added 2 thick slices of bread beside it. Then, walking back out into the biting cold, I placed the bowl on the floor just inside the barn door, in the sliver of light from the porch. I didn't peek inside. I just left the offering and retreated back to the house, where I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, watching the barn, waiting. I heard nothing. No more sounds of pain, no movement. After an hour, I gave up and fell into a restless sleep. The image of those intelligent, terrified eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I woke before dawn, a knot of dread and anticipation in my stomach. I pulled on my boots and walked to the barn. The air was crisp and still. The bowl was right where I had left it. It was empty, licked completely clean, and placed perfectly upright. The creature was gone. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. Just a few strands of long, dark hair caught on the splintered wood of the doorframe, and a single, massive footprint in the snow leading away from the barn and disappearing into the dense black woods at the edge of my property. It was real. It had all been real. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones. staring at that clean bowl and the impossible footprint. I had a choice to make. I could tell someone, try to explain what had happened, and be called a lunatic or a liar, or I could keep this to myself. I could hold this impossible secret in the quiet solitude of the farm. I looked out at the silent woods, then back at the empty barn. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for my decision. I picked up the bowl, went back inside, and shut the door on the world. I chose silence. That was the second choice, the one that sealed my fate for the next 52 years and set me on a collision course with the full, terrifying weight of the United States government. This is just the beginning. The pact we made that night, the rules we lived by for decades, the family it raised in the shadows of my farm. It's a story I have to tell. It's the only thing I have left to give them. I know this sounds impossible, but I ask you to keep listening. The truth of what they are is more incredible than you can imagine, and the reason they hide is a warning to us all. If you believe that some things are worth protecting, if you believe that there's more to this world than what we can see, then please, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And please, stay with me until the end. You need to hear what happened when Agent Miller showed up at my door. You need to hear the truth. That first night of silence was almost worse than the sound of the trap. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, expecting to hear a scream, a roar, the sound of the sheriff's car coming up the drive. But there was nothing, just the whisper of the wind and the pounding in my own ears. I had made a choice, but I didn't know if it was the right one. I had interfered with something that didn't belong to the world I knew. Come morning, with the clean bowl in my hand and the impossible footprint fading in the sun, I knew I had to do it again. It wasn't a thought, it was a pull, a need to know. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, I filled the bowl again. Same stew. This time, I also took one of my old, worn-out leather work gloves and placed it beside the bowl. It felt like a stupid, childish gesture, a piece of me, a sign. I was offering more than just food. I was offering a connection. The next morning, my boots crunched on the frosted ground as I walked to the barn. The air was so cold it felt sharp in my lungs. My heart was doing that same frantic beat as the first night. The bowl was gone. The glove was gone too. My stomach dropped. I thought maybe I had misread everything, that they had just taken what they could get. But then I saw it. Sitting exactly where the bowl and glove had been was a single, smooth, gray riverstone. It was perfectly round, almost polished, and cool to the touch. It wasn't just a rock, it was placed there, deliberately. An object for an object. Food for what? Gratitude. Acknowledgement. It was the first word in a conversation that would last 52 years. A trade had been made. I picked up the stone, its weight solid and real in my palm. It was the first piece of evidence, the first link in a chain that would wrap around my entire life. The pact had begun. A few nights later, I saw her, the mother. I was on the porch, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, the way I always did. She didn't make a sound. She just emerged from the tree line, a giantess made of shadow and silence. She was immense, maybe 9 feet tall, broad and powerful. Her presence so profound it felt like the air pressure dropped. The young one was nowhere to be seen. She just stood there, about 100 yards away, watching me. I froze, my hand halfway to my mouth. But there was no menace in her stance. It was pure, unwavering observation. She wasn't a threat. She was a question. She was the one in charge, the matriarch, and she was sizing me up, deciding if the pact her child had made was safe. I felt that I was being judged, weighed and measured. I gave a slow, single nod, just as I had to the young one. She watched me for a long moment more, then turned with a fluidity that was impossible for something her size, and melted back into the pines. The pact was sealed. From that day on, the ritual became the engine of my life. It gave shape to my lonely days and purpose to the long nights. Every evening, just as dusk settled, I would take the big metal bucket from its hook by the door. The sound of me filling it became a signal, I think. The scrape of the scoop in the oat bin, the dull thud of apples dropping in, the slosh of fresh water. Sometimes, after a successful hunt, I'd leave a whole deer quarter. It was a significant sacrifice for a man living alone on a struggling farm, but it never felt like a loss. It felt like an investment, a tithe. I'd carry the bucket to the same spot, just outside the barn, and leave it. The routine was a comfort. It was a promise I made every single day, and the consistency of it was the only thing I could control in a world that had taken so much from me. It was a silent dinner with a family I could never truly meet, but whose presence I felt constantly. Every morning, the food would be gone. The bucket would be placed carefully aside, always upright, and in its place, there would be a gift. At first, it was simple things, more of those smooth river stones, sometimes arranged in a small circle. Once, a strangely shaped piece of driftwood that looked like a bird in flight. They were showing me they understood the exchange. They weren't just taking, they were giving back, balancing the scales. I started a collection on the mantelpiece in the farmhouse. A row of strange stones, a twisted branch, a piece of quartz that glittered in the firelight. They were my secret treasures, the physical proof of my impossible reality. Each object was a word, a sentence in our silent language. They were telling me they were intelligent, that they had an eye for beauty, for uniqueness. They were showing me a part of their world, a world I could only ever glimpse through these small, curated offerings left in the cold light of dawn. The barn became their sanctuary, their embassy. That was the first unspoken rule. I quickly realized they were using it for more than just a brief visit. On quiet nights, I'd hear things. A soft shuffling from within, a deep, rumbling sigh that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the farmhouse. But I never, ever went inside the barn after dark. That was their time. My domain was the house. Theirs was the barn and the woods beyond. In the mornings, when I'd go to milk the single cow I kept, I would find signs. A new, deep bed of hay had been arranged in the far, dark corner of the loft, a place I rarely went. Sometimes I'd find a small pile of pine cones, stripped clean, left on a beam. The rule was clear, established through mutual respect and avoidance. I owned the barn in the daylight, but it belonged to them in the darkness. It was a shared space, a bridge between our two worlds, and crossing that line felt like a profound violation. The second rule was about light. They were creatures of the threshold, of dusk and dawn and deep, moonless nights. I never, not once in 52 years, saw them in the full, unforgiving light of day. They were masters of the shadows, able to move their immense forms through the dense woods without snapping a twig. I learned this rule the hard way. One afternoon, my neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, had his truck break down on the county road that bordered my property. He was out there for hours, banging and cursing, and the whole time, the woods behind my house were different. The air was tense, electric with a silent, concentrated fear. It wasn't my fear, it was theirs. A palpable wave of anxiety rolling out of the trees. The world had come too close. That day taught me that their secrecy wasn't just a preference, it was a desperate, life-or-death necessity. Daylight was a boundary, a wall they could not cross. The gifts evolved. What started as stones and wood became something far more profound. One morning, I found a braid of cedar bark left on the porch railing. It was woven with a complexity and precision that took my breath away. It was thick as my wrist, and woven into it were the feathers of a hawk and the white fur of a winter hare. It was art. It was a story. It was a message I could feel but not translate. Over the years, there were more. Intricate patterns of woven grass. Small carvings on pieces of antler that were too soft and detailed to have been made by a knife. These weren't just objects, they were expressions. They were a sign of a deep, complex culture, of a mind capable of symbolism and beauty. My mantelpiece collection grew, becoming a small, secret museum of their existence. It was through these objects that I began to understand that I wasn't just feeding animals, I was in communion with a people. The third rule became apparent very quickly. When I had visitors, they vanished. Not just from sight, but from existence. If the vet came to check on my cow, or if Clara, the woman I would later marry, stopped by with a pie, the woods went inert. The feeling of being watched, a constant companion, would just switch off. On those days, the bucket of food I left out would be untouched the next morning. It would sit there, a lonely offering, until the following night. They had an uncanny ability to sense the presence of another human, a stranger. It was their ultimate security protocol. Our pact was strictly between me and them, no witnesses. This rule, more than any other, reinforced my isolation. To maintain my connection with them, I had to deepen my separation from the human world. My secret became a fortress, and I was its willing, solitary guard. Our exchange began to transcend food for objects. It became a dialogue about the land we shared. One spring, I found a fence post by the western pasture had been knocked over by a falling tree. I was busy with planting and hadn't gotten to it. A few nights later, I found the heavy post had been lifted and propped back in place. It wasn't fixed, just pointed out. A gentle nudge. Another time, I left a broken shovel near the offering spot. A silent complaint about my workload. The next morning, the shovel was gone. In its place was the fresh, pungent scat of a large mountain lion, and beside it, a single, deep claw mark gouged into the dirt. The message was clear. There are real problems. This is not one of them. They were watching over the farm, aware of its rhythms and its dangers. They were becoming its silent, unseen guardians. I learned to talk back, using the same language of objects and actions. One year, the radio warned of a brutal, early blizzard coming in. A real killer storm. I couldn't bear the thought of them out in it, especially the young one. That night, along with the usual bucket, I left a pile of old, heavy wool blankets and a thick canvas tarp by the barn door. I didn't know if they would understand. I just had to try. I spent the next 2 days snowed in, listening to the wind howl, praying they were safe. When the storm finally broke, the blankets and tarp were gone. And on my front porch, placed squarely in the middle of the welcome mat, was a perfectly cleaned deer skull. A magnificent 8-point buck. It was a gesture of immense gratitude. A gift of a successful hunt. A sign that they had weathered the storm, thanks to me. Our bond was no longer just a pact. It was a partnership. Their language of sounds was another layer I slowly began to decipher. It wasn't the roars and screams of monster movies. It was subtle, complex, and surprisingly gentle. I learned to distinguish the soft, inquisitive chuffing of the young one from the deep, resonant hum the matriarch would sometimes make. A sound that felt more like a vibration in the ground than something you heard with your ears. From the deep woods, I would sometimes hear a rapid series of clicks, followed by a low whistle, a conversation I could never hope to understand, but whose cadence I came to recognize. Their movements were the most shocking thing. For such massive beings, they were almost completely silent, when they chose to be. The few times I caught a glimpse of them moving through the trees, their footsteps made no more sound than pillows falling on moss. The silence was a tool, a part of their language, as meaningful as any sound. The final rule was the most important, the one that governed everything. It was the rule of absolute, unbroken silence. Not their silence, but mine. This pact was a secret that had to be kept, no matter the cost. It was born from my own fear, a terrifying vision of what would happen if the world found them. The cameras, the scientists, the guns, the cages. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that humanity would destroy them. Either through fear or through curiosity, the result would be the same. So I never spoke a word. Not to the mailman, not to the feed store owner, not even for many years, to Clara. This secret became the central pillar of my life. A silent, parallel existence lived between the farmhouse and the barn. The barn was a church of shadows and dust, and they were its sacred, hidden congregation. I was their sole priest, and my silence was the most important prayer I could offer. This ritual, this constant, careful dance, became the rhythm of my life. The nightly offering, the morning discovery. It filled the vast, hollow space that my father's death had carved inside me. The farm was no longer just a weight of responsibility. It was a sanctuary I was charged with protecting. My grief didn't disappear, but it found a new purpose. I wasn't just a lonely man on a hill anymore. I was a keeper, a guardian of something ancient and impossible. This routine, this vitiating loop of exchange, gave my life a meaning I had never expected to find. I was bound to them, and they to me, by a series of unspoken laws and a shared, silent understanding. The mystery of what they were didn't need to be solved. It needed to be lived. And for decades, that's exactly what I did. I lived the mystery, day in and day out, never realizing that the outside world was getting closer, and that our quiet, fragile peace was living on borrowed time. Over the decades, they became the ghosts of the farm, their lives interwoven with mine in a silent tapestry. The young one I first met, the one with the terrified eyes, grew into a massive, powerful male. I watched him from a distance, a hulking shadow at the tree line, as he taught his own child to mimic the piercing call of a red-tailed hawk. It was a perfect, eerie imitation that would echo across the valley, a secret language hidden in plain sight. One afternoon, I saw the little one, no bigger than a human child, sitting on a log, clumsily trying to weave blades of grass together, its large, dark eyes focused in concentration, its huge father watching over it from the shadows with a patience that felt achingly familiar. In those moments, I wasn't just a keeper. I felt like a witness to a lineage, a silent godfather to a family that existed just beyond the veil of my world. My own life was marked by the turning of seasons, but theirs was a calendar I could only guess at, written in the growth of their young and the changing patterns they left behind for me to find. Their role as guardians became undeniable. One summer, a persistent cougar started preying on my calves, taking 2 in a single week. I spent nights on the porch with the 30-06 across my lap, tired and frustrated, listening for the slightest sound. The financial loss was one thing, but the feeling of helplessness was worse. Then, one morning, the attacks just stopped. I went out at dawn, my gut tight with dread, expecting to find another kill. Instead, I found the cougar's body laid out perfectly straight at the far fence line, its neck snapped clean with a terrifying urtung, brutal efficiency. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, just the predator, laid out like an offering. It was a grisly, shocking gift, but the message was unmistakable. This is our home, too. We protect our own. They were paying me back for the food and shelter not with trinkets, but with a fierce, absolute loyalty. They were a part of the farm's ecosystem, the apex predators who had chosen a side, and that side was mine. That morning, I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound, humbling sense of security. The mystery of their intelligence only deepened. On the great, old beams inside the barn, strange grooves began to appear, carved deep into the wood. They weren't random scratches. They were patterns, complex and deliberate. Some looked like star charts, clusters of dots and lines that seemed to mirror the constellations I saw in the clear winter sky. Others changed with the seasons, spiraling patterns in the spring, long, wavy lines in the summer, and sharp, geometric shapes when the first snows fell. It was a chronicle, a calendar I couldn't read. I would run my fingers over the grooves, the wood worn smooth by time and their touch, and feel the weight of their history. It was a silent, ongoing story etched into the very bones of my barn. This wasn't the behavior of a simple beast hiding from the world. This was the work of a people with a sense of time, a connection to the cycles of the earth and sky, and a need to record their existence, even if I was the only one who would ever see it. The first real threat didn't come with a roar or a gunshot. It came with the persistent, distant sound of progress. A new subdivision. One of those luxury developments for rich city folks went up a few miles east of my property line. For an entire year, the faint, grinding hum of heavy machinery was a constant presence, a dull ache in the background of my quiet life. The air, which had always been so still, now carried the sounds of nail guns and backup beepers. From the high ridge, I could see the skeletal frames of massive houses going up, their picture windows staring blankly in my direction. My family in the woods grew wary. The air of tension that I'd only felt when a stranger's car came too close was now a permanent fixture. The morning gifts became less frequent, more cautious. The woods were pulling back, retreating from the encroaching noise and light, and our shared sanctuary began to feel a lot smaller, its borders shrinking day by day. Once the houses were built, the new residents arrived, and with them, a new kind of danger. Casual, oblivious intrusion. They weren't malicious people, just ignorant of the land's unwritten rules. They saw the woods as their personal playground. I'd hear the high-pitched whine of their kids, dirt bikes tearing through trails that had been silent for a century, the sounds like angry wasps in the quiet afternoon. Their dogs would run loose, barking at ghosts in the trees. At night, the powerful headlights of their expensive SUVs would sweep across my lower pastures as they missed their new driveways. Each sound, each beam of light, was a small violation, a jab at the fragile peace I had curated for so long. The family in the woods became even more scarce. Some days, the feeling of them being there would vanish completely, as if they'd simply ceased to exist, scared into absolute stillness by the constant, unpredictable activity just beyond the trees. My anxiety became a physical thing, a knot in my stomach that never went away. I started walking the property line every single day, my old shotgun crooked in my arm. I wasn't hunting, I was patrolling. I found the first signs of direct trespass near the creek that bordered my land. Empty beer cans and the charred circle of a small, illegal campfire. A few weeks later, I found sneaker prints in the mud, not 20 yards from the barn itself. The desecration felt personal, a slap in the face. My anger was cold and sharp. I put up new, larger, no trespassing, and private property signs, nailing them to trees every 50 feet. It felt futile. I was trying to hold back the tide with a few pieces of painted wood. The comforting feeling of being watched by my silent guardians was now tainted by a new, prickling paranoia. Was that rustle in the bushes the gentle movement of the matriarch, or a teenager looking for thrills? My sanctuary was becoming a prison, and I, its warden. Then came the day the world almost broke in. It was a clear, crisp afternoon in the late fall. I was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound. Until it wasn't. A new sound started, a high-pitched, electric whine, like a mosquito right next to your ear, but louder. I looked up, scanning the sky, and I saw it. A small black drone, like a malevolent insect, hovering 100 feet up. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just flying over my property. It was hovering directly, deliberately, over my barn. I dropped the axe. My heart seized in my chest, a fist of pure panic. They were in there. I knew they were. The matriarch, the guardian, the little one, huddled in the shadows of the loft, terrified, listening to that alien sound right above their heads. The one place they were supposed to be safe. It was the ultimate violation. A mechanical eye peering into the heart of our secret world. For a moment, I was paralyzed by a tidal wave of helpless fury. My mind raced. I couldn't shoot it down. The sound of a rifle shot would bring the owner running, or worse, the sheriff. They'd ask questions I couldn't answer. I had to create a distraction, something big enough to spook the pilot, to make them think they were in trouble for being here. Without a second thought, I sprinted, not towards the barn, but away from it, towards the far pasture. Pure animal instinct took over. My only thought was, protect them. I grabbed the 5-gallon can of gasoline I kept for the tractor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unscrew the cap. I ran to a huge pile of old, dry hay and brush I'd been meaning to clear for months. I didn't hesitate. I drenched the pile, the sharp, chemical smell of gasoline filling the air. It felt insane, reckless. It was the act of a desperate man. I fumbled for the lighter in my pocket, my thumb slipping on the flint. The spark caught. The whoosh of the ignition was a sudden, violent roar. The fire exploded upwards, a churning ball of orange and yellow, and then a thick column of greasy, black smoke billowed into the clear blue sky. It was a huge, ugly, unmissable signal, a plume of panic that I had sent up myself. I stood back, my face hot, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the smoke climb. I knew it was a terrible risk. Starting an uncontrolled fire in the dry season was a cardinal sin out here. It was a beacon that would bring exactly the kind of official attention I had spent my life avoiding. But as I watched the smoke ascend, I heard the high-pitched whine of the drone change. It wobbled, then zipped away to the east, back towards the subdivision. It worked. I had traded one kind of exposure for another. I had bought them a few more moments of secrecy, but I knew, standing there with the heat of the flames on my skin, that it would come at a price. It didn't take long. Within 15 minutes, I heard the distant, mournful wail of a siren. It grew steadily louder, a sound that has always meant trouble. Soon, the big red fire truck from the Gallatin County Volunteer Fire Department was lumbering up my long gravel driveway, kicking up dust. Chief Brody, a man I'd known since he was a boy, climbed out, his face a grim mask of disapproval. "Elias, what in God's name are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration as his men started unreeling the hoses. I fed him the lie I'd rehearsed in my head. "Just a controlled burn, Brody." Wind picked up faster than I expected. The lie felt like ash in my mouth. He just stared at me, then at the billowing smoke, his eyes full of a new kind of suspicion. I got the official lecture, a warning, and a notice for a hefty fine in the mail a week later. That was the tangible cost. The real cost was the look in Brody's eyes. The moment he stopped seeing me as a harmless old farmer and started seeing me as a problem. The fine was something I could pay. The shift in how the community saw me was something else entirely. Word travels fast in a small town. I became the eccentric old thorn, the recluse on the hill who recklessly starts fires. I felt the change in the way people looked at me at the feed store, the quiet conversations that stopped when I walked past. The isolation that had once been my choice, my shield, was now a brand of suspicion that had been burned onto me. I sat on my porch that night, long after the fire was out and the truck was gone, the smell of smoke still clinging to everything. The farm didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a trap. The secret was no longer a quiet, parallel life. It was a heavy, dangerous burden that was starting to crack under its own weight. I had protected them, but in doing so, I had painted a target on my own back. The world was closing in, and I was running out of places to hide. That night, the woods were utterly, terrifyingly silent. The offering bucket sat untouched, the food freezing in the cold air. The fear from the drone, the fire, the sirens, it had been too much. I was sure I had finally broken our 50-year bond of trust. My desperate, loud, human solution had shattered their world of silence. I stayed up late, staring out at the black, unmoving wall of trees, feeling a loneliness so profound it was like a physical ache in my chest. It was the same hollow emptiness I'd felt the year my father died, but this time it was worse. Because this loss was my own damn fault. I had invited the noise of the world in, and it had scared them away. I went to bed thinking it was over, that they were gone for good, and the silence they left behind was the sound of my failure. It was the sound of my life's purpose vanishing into the dark. I woke before dawn, my body stiff with a cold dread. I didn't want to go outside, didn't want to see the full bucket that would confirm my fears. But I forced myself up, pulled on my boots, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was frigid and still. The bucket was still there, untouched. My heart sank into my boots. It was over. I had failed them. But then, as I turned to go back inside, I saw it. Placed squarely on the worn welcome mat, directly in front of the door where I would have to step on it, was a single object. A perfect jet-black crow's feather. It was stark and beautiful against the faded mat. A sliver of night left behind in the pale morning light. My breath caught in my throat. I knelt down slowly, my old knees cracking in protest, and picked it up. It was almost weightless, a fragile piece of evidence that they were still there, still watching. I stood on the porch for a long time, the feather resting in my palm. My frantic, fiery act hadn't broken the pact. They understood, but what was the message? A crow feather. It wasn't like their other gifts. The stones, the carvings, the woven bark. It felt different. Crows are watchers, messengers, intelligent and wary. Was it a thank you for driving off the eye in the sky? Or was it a warning? A symbol of the dark wings I had invited to circle my property? The silence that followed the drone. The profound terror that a simple machine could instill in them. It started a new, terrifying thought in my mind. They weren't just hiding from curious kids and careless hunters. The drone, the motor in the sky, it represented something specific, something they recognized and feared on a primal level. The near disaster had taught me a terrible lesson. This wasn't a game of hide and seek. It was a rehearsal for a war I didn't understand, and the enemy was already in the air. The year Clara got sick was the year the lines between my worlds blurred into a painful, inseparable gray. The chemotherapy hollowed her out, turning the vibrant woman I loved into a fragile ghost haunting the rooms of our home. My grief wasn't a distant thunder anymore. It was a constant, bitter taste in the back of my throat, a pressure behind my eyes that never left. The farm chores became a Sisyphean task, each bucket of feed, each mended fence post, a monument to the life that was draining away inside the house. My nightly ritual with the family in the woods continued, but it was mechanical, joyless. I'd leave the food, retrieve the strange gifts, but my heart wasn't in it. I was functioning on fumes, trapped between two impossible responsibilities, caring for the dying and guarding the unknown. The silence in the farmhouse was no longer peaceful. It was the suffocating silence of a sick room, thick with the smell of medicine and unspoken goodbyes. My secret felt less like a wonder and more like another heavy stone on my already breaking back. One evening in early October, the weight of it all just broke me. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a beauty that felt like a mockery. Clara was asleep, her breathing shallow and ragged. I couldn't stand to be in the house, but I couldn't bear to be far. So I just sat on the cold front porch steps, my head buried in my hands, and I finally let go. The sobs came from a place so deep inside me, I didn't recognize them. Raw and ugly sounds of a man being torn apart. I wasn't just crying for Clara, I was crying for the last 30 years, for the loneliness of my secret, for the fear of the future, for the utter, crushing exhaustion of it all. I was a ship taking on water from all sides, and I could feel myself starting to sink into the cold, dark deep. The world had shrunk to the space between my own shaking hands, and in that moment, I felt a loneliness more profound than any I had ever known. It was a sound that pulled me out of it, not a snap or a rustle, but a change in the air itself, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the ground and up through the wooden steps. I lifted my head, my face wet, my vision blurry, and I saw her, the matriarch. She was old now, her dark fur streaked with threads of gray, just like the hair at my own temples. She had walked out of the tree line and was standing not 100 yards away, clear as day in the fading twilight. She had never, ever come this close to the house. It was a violation of the rules, of everything we had built. But she wasn't looking at the house, or the barn. She was looking directly at me. Her ancient, dark eyes held no fear, no curiosity, only a calm, unwavering focus. She took another slow, deliberate step forward, then another, closing the distance until she was maybe 20 yards away, a mountain of silent empathy against the dying light. She didn't make a move toward me. She just stopped, lowered her immense form to the ground, and sat on her haunches, her huge hands resting on her knees. It was a strangely human posture, a posture of waiting, of watching. And then she made a sound I had never heard before and have never heard since. It wasn't a growl or a call. It was a low, mournful hum that vibrated in my bones, a sound that felt older than the trees around us. It was the sound of grief itself, given form. She wasn't threatening me or questioning me. She was mourning with me. She had felt the wave of my despair rolling off the porch and had crossed the sacred boundary between our worlds to answer it. She sat there, humming that deep, sorrowful note until the moon was high and cold in the sky, a silent, impossible vigil for a pain she couldn't have understood but chose to share anyway. That night, she wasn't a cryptid or a secret. She was the only soul on earth who saw my grief, and she didn't turn away. A few weeks after we buried Clara next to my father, on the hill overlooking the farm, the mail took me into the woods. She had been gone a month, and the silence she left behind was a physical presence, a gaping wound in the world. The nightly ritual was all I had left, the only routine that mattered. But this morning was different. When I went to retrieve the empty bucket, he was there, waiting at the edge of the trees, the one I'd found in the trap all those years ago, now a towering, powerful guardian. He didn't just leave a gift. He looked at me, then turned and took a few steps into the woods. Before looking back, an invitation. It was the first time in 50 years that either of us had suggested breaking the most sacred rule of all. I never entered their domain. My heart hammered in my chest. Fear mingled with a desperate curiosity. My old life was over, buried on that hill. I had nothing left to lose. I took a breath, stepped off my land, and followed him into the deep woods. The world changed the moment I crossed the tree line. The air grew cooler, thicker, smelling of deep, damp earth and pine needles and something else, something ancient and wild. The sounds of the farm, the wind whistling around the eaves of the barn, the distant hum of the county road, vanished, replaced by a profound, listening silence. He moved ahead of me with an impossible grace, his massive, dark form gliding between the ancient pines without making a sound. He wasn't just walking, he was leading me on a path that wasn't there, a route known only to him. We walked for what felt like miles, deeper and deeper into a part of the forest I had only ever seen from a distance. a place that felt older and stranger than anything I knew. I felt like a trespasser in a great green cathedral. My clumsy human footsteps, a desecration in the hallowed quiet. He never looked back, but I could feel his awareness of me, a silent reassurance that I was safe. We finally arrived in a small, hidden clearing. The canopy overhead was so thick that only a few dappled shafts of sunlight reached the ground, which was covered in a blanket of soft, green moss. The air here was perfectly still, and the silence was absolute. It felt like a sacred place, a secret heart of the forest. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the moss and dark earth, lay a strange, dark gray rock. It was about the size of a car battery, and its surface was completely wrong. It wasn't stone. As I knelt beside it, I could see it had no grain, no texture. It was perfectly, unnaturally smooth, and even in the shade, it felt cool to the touch, like metal that had been buried for 1,000 years. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It didn't belong here. It didn't feel like it belonged anywhere on Earth. It hummed with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. A low thrum I felt more in my teeth than in my ears. The guardian stood over me, a silent, towering figure. He watched me as I ran my trembling fingers over the smooth, cold surface of the object. Then, he did something that shattered my understanding of the world. He reached down with one long, powerful finger and tapped the metallic rock. One slow, deliberate tap. The low hum intensified for a second, a soft blue light flickering deep within it before fading. Then, he lifted his arm and pointed straight up, through the gap in the canopy, at the pale afternoon sky where, if it were night, the constellation Orion would be hanging. He held the pose for a long moment, finger aimed at the heavens. Then he repeated the sequence. Tap the rock, point to the sky. He was communicating. He was trying to tell me something, not with a gift or a carving, but with a direct, profound statement. The object and the sky were connected. He wasn't finished. He performed the sequence one more time. He tapped the strange rock. He pointed to the sky, at that same spot. Then, he lowered his arm and slowly, deliberately, tapped his own broad chest with his fist. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. And then, he reached out his long finger and gently, so gently, tapped my chest. Right over my heart. He held my gaze, his ancient, intelligent eyes full of a meaning I was just beginning to grasp. And he did it again. Sky. His chest. My chest. Sky. Us. He did it 3 times, a solemn, repeated mantra. The message, after 50 years of silence and riddles, was starting to break through the fog of my grief and my ignorance. My breath caught in my throat. A realization, cold and vast and terrifying, began to dawn in the back of my mind, connecting everything. Their silence, their intelligence, their fear of the drone. They weren't just hiding from hunters and curious teenagers. They were hiding from something so much bigger, so much more fundamental. The fear they had of the drone wasn't just about being seen, it was about being recognized. The carvings on the barn beams that looked like star charts suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. The strange, metallic object humming in the heart of their sacred space was not a rock. It was a piece of something, a piece of a journey. My mind reeled. The silent family I had sheltered for half a century. The ghosts of my farm, the monsters of local legend. They weren't from around here, and I didn't mean from another county. The message was clear, simple, and world-shattering. They came from the sky. They were survivors. They were castaways. And their greatest fear was that we, the loud, violent, curious species that surrounded them, would find out not just what they were, but where they were from. Everything changed for me in that clearing. My 50-year promise to protect them was no longer about saving a strange species of animal from being discovered. It was about something infinitely more complex and dangerous. This secret was bigger than my farm, bigger than Montana, bigger than anything I could have ever imagined. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this knowledge was the most dangerous thing in the world. If you've listened this far, you're a part of this secret now, too. You understand that this is more than just a creature feature. This is about a promise that spans worlds. If this story means something to you, if you believe in the promise I made, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this confession. It's important, and you have to stay with me until the end. because this revelation is what brought them. It's what put the man in the crisp suit, Agent Miller, on my front porch, and what he did next. You need to hear it. Homeland Security didn't arrive with sirens and flashing lights. They came with the quiet, chilling efficiency of a disease. A single, black sedan, so clean it seemed to absorb the afternoon light, crunched up my gravel driveway one Tuesday. A man in a crisp, dark suit that didn't belong in rural Montana stepped out. He wasn't armed, not visibly, but he carried something far more threatening, a clipboard and the unshakable confidence of a man who never loses. "Elias Thorne?" he asked, his voice flat and professional, offering a hand I didn't take. "My name is Agent Miller, Department of Homeland Security." He didn't seem to notice my rudeness. He just smiled, a thin, meaningless expression. "We have a court order to conduct a non-invasive survey of your property. May we speak for a moment?" The world, which had already felt fragile, seemed to turn to glass around me. I knew, with a certainty that made me sick, that this was about the rock. It was about the sky. The outside world had finally found the key to my door, and they were about to turn it. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Clara and I had eaten 1,000 meals, and laid it out in a calm, reasonable tone that made my blood run cold. He said a routine satellite sweep, part of a national infrastructure security program, had detected a persistent, low-frequency electromagnetic pulse originating from somewhere on my property. He used terms like anomalous and unidentified signature. They had two theories, he explained, looking me right in the eye. One, it was a piece of buried, forgotten Cold War-era spy technology, maybe a Soviet listening post. Or two, it was a private, illegal, long-range transmitter. "I'm just a farmer from Gallatin County, Agent Miller," I said, my voice sounding thin and weak even to my own ears. "Nothing here but dirt and memories." The lie felt like swallowing sand. All I could see was the Guardian's finger tapping that smooth, dark object. They hadn't found a monster. They had found its SOS, a message in a bottle that had finally, after all these years, washed ashore. Miller didn't believe me for a second. His eyes, a pale and forgettable blue, were anything but. They were scanners. They swept over my simple kitchen, lingering on the mantelpiece where my collection of river stones and woven cedar bark sat in plain sight. I felt a jolt of pure panic, realizing my secret museum was on full display. He didn't comment on it, but I saw the flicker of interest, the micro-expression of a man filing away a detail that didn't fit. "I'm sure that's the case, Mr. Thorne," he said, his polite tone never wavering. "This should just be a formality, then. We'll be as quick as we can." But the way he looked out the window, his gaze sweeping over the old barn, the deep, dark woods beyond the pasture, it wasn't the look of a man searching for a machine. It was the look of a predator surveying its territory, mapping out every shadow, every possible hiding place. He wasn't just investigating a signal, he was investigating a secret, and he could smell it in the air. That afternoon was a quiet, waking nightmare. Miller was joined by a small team of 3 others, men and women who moved with the same silent, unnerving professionalism. They didn't speak to me. They spoke to each other in low tones, through earpieces, their faces illuminated by the glow of tablets and strange handheld devices. I was forced to walk with them as they established a perimeter, the court order making me a guest on my own land. I watched them plant small yellow flags in the ground, their movements precise and methodical. The whole time, I could feel the woods. It wasn't my imagination. The usual ambient noise of the forest was gone. There were no birds, no squirrels. There was only a profound, listening silence, a terrified silence. I could feel their fear from across the fields, a palpable tension in the air, a silent scream that only I could hear. They were watching us, huddled in the deep dark, as the modern world, in its sterile, implacable form, mapped the borders of their prison. That night, the ritual was broken for the first time in 52 years. The government vehicles were parked at the end of my drive, a silent, black blockade. I couldn't go to the barn. I couldn't leave the food. The pact, the one constant in my life, had been severed by their mere presence. I sat in the dark farmhouse, the lights off, watching the silhouettes of my uninvited guests. The guilt was a physical sickness, a sour knot in my stomach. They were out there in the cold, waiting for a signal that would never come. They would think I had abandoned them or betrayed them. I had failed in my one sacred duty. The silence from the woods was no longer a sign of their presence, but of their absence. It was a dead silence, the kind that follows a tragedy. The connection that had been my life's work, my one true purpose, was cut, and I was more alone than I had ever been, trapped in a house that was no longer a home, guarding a secret that was about to be ripped out into the light. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. Every creak of the old house was an agent at the door. Every gust of wind was the sound of them coming for me. My mind was a torture chamber, replaying my conversation with Miller, dissecting every word, every lie, convinced I had already slipped up and given them everything. The paranoia was a physical sickness, crawling over my skin like insects. I felt watched, not by the gentle guardians of the woods, but by the cold, analytical gaze of the federal government. The weight of what I knew, the truth I'd discovered in that mossy clearing, was a crushing physical burden. It wasn't just a family of creatures anymore. It was a cosmic secret, a piece of technology, a potential weapon. I wasn't just hiding a species. I was hiding the keys to a kingdom, and the kings had finally come knocking at my door. The next morning, Miller was back on my porch before the sun had fully risen. The false politeness from the day before was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of professional impatience. "Mr. Thorne," he began, not even waiting for me to open the door all the way. "Our initial passive scans confirmed the signal's origin is on your property, but the signature is being distorted, possibly by geological formations or shielding." He looked directly at the barn as he said it. "We're done with passive measures. We're bringing in the ground-penetrating radar unit this morning. We need to do a full grid scan of the main property, starting with the outbuildings." The phrase, ground-penetrating radar, hit me like a physical blow. It was the sound of the end. A machine that could see through walls, see through the ground, see through 52 years of lies and secrecy. My carefully constructed world of shadows and silence was about to be exposed by a hum and a series of lines on a screen. He didn't need to explain what it meant, but he did anyway, his voice cold and final. "It's a small unit. On a wheeled cart. We'll run a grid pattern. It'll show us any metallic objects, voids, or unusual densities beneath the surface. We'll start with the barn, then move out in concentric circles until we find the source of the signal." He looked at his watch. "The team will be here in an hour. We'll need access to the barn." An hour. He had given me a 1-hour deadline before my entire life was shattered. The paranoia and dread of the last 24 hours crystallized into a single, sharp point of absolute terror. They were going to go into the barn, their sacred space, the place they were born, the place they sheltered, the place where their history was carved into the beams. They were going to desecrate the church, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. My promise to protect them was about to be broken in the most brutal way imaginable. My mind was a whirlwind of desperate, useless plans. I could confess. I could stand in front of the barn door and scream the whole impossible truth. They'd think I was a crazy old man and haul me away. But would it buy the family enough time to flee? Flee where? The world was closing in on all sides. I could start another fire, a bigger one this time, but they wouldn't be fooled twice. All I could think about were their eyes, the matriarch's mournful gaze, the guardian's intelligent stare. I finally understood their profound, primal fear. They weren't just hiding from being discovered. They were hiding from what we would do once we found them. They knew that a species like ours, a species that heard a strange signal and immediately sent men with technology to claim it, wouldn't see a family of refugees. They would see a prize. They would see a weapon. They would see the ultimate tactical advantage. And they would tear them apart to get it. The last hour was the longest of my life. I stood on my porch, a helpless old man in worn-out boots, and watched the sun climb over the mountains, illuminating the dust motes in the cold morning air. My farm was no longer my own. It was a staging ground, an occupied territory. The air itself felt different, charged with a low hum of anticipation and dread. I could feel their terror from the woods, a silent, pulsing wave of it. After 52 winters of trust, 52 years of shared silence, and a life built on a promise, it was all coming down to the hum of a government machine and the curiosity of men who couldn't leave a mystery alone. The end was here. It was inevitable. I had built a fortress of secrecy to protect them, but I had only succeeded in turning my farm into the perfect, isolated laboratory for their dissection. And I, their loyal guardian, had led the enemy right to their door. The sound of their boots on the gravel was like a countdown. Miller and his team, their faces impassive and professional, were walking toward the barn. My sanctuary. I stood in their way, a 72-year-old man shaking in his worn-out boots, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was about to confess. I was about to scream the whole impossible story, to throw my life away to buy them a few more seconds of escape. My mouth was open, the words forming on my tongue, when a deep, groaning creak silenced everything. It was the sound of the great wooden barn door, a sound I hadn't heard from the outside in 50 years, as it slowly swung open. The agents stopped dead in their tracks, their professionalism dissolving into pure, primal shock. And there, silhouetted in the dark doorway against the morning light, stood the Guardian. He was immense, a towering figure of shadow and muscle, Mbiti. But his posture was not one of aggression. It was one of profound, heartbreaking resignation. The agents reacted instantly. There was a series of sharp, metallic clicks as safeties were disengaged and rifles were raised. I heard a sharp intake of breath from one of the technicians, a muttered, "Jesus Christ." They saw a monster, a threat to be neutralized. But I saw the truth. I saw my friend, the boy I'd found in a trap. Now a patriarch standing ready to sacrifice himself for his family. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, out of the shadows and into the full, unforgiving light of day. His huge, dark hands were held open at his sides, palms forward, in a universal gesture of peace. In his right palm, resting like a dark, alien heart, was the metallic rock from the clearing. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to end it, to finally show them what they were hunting. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear, the silence broken only by the frantic beat of my own heart and the heavy, ragged sound of his breathing. As the armed agents stared, their trigger fingers tense, the rock in his hand began to emit a low, resonant hum. It was the sound from the clearing, but louder now, a vibration that you felt in your teeth and in the soles of your feet. A soft, pulsating blue light bloomed from within the object, casting strange, shifting shadows on his fur and on the terrified faces of the agents. And in that moment, seeing the Guardian's terrified, intelligent eyes and the agent's trigger-happy fear, I finally, fully understood. The gestures, the carvings, the 52 years of hiding, it all crashed down on me in a single, devastating wave of insight. It wasn't about being hunted, it was about being found. He looked at me one last time, a look of profound sorrow and apology, as if to say, "I'm sorry it has to end this way." Then he turned his gaze back to the agents and their weapons, and began his final message, the one he was willing to die to deliver. He slowly raised the hand holding the glowing object. He tapped the rock, and the blue light pulsed brightly. Then he pointed not to the sky, but directly at Agent Miller. He then swept his arm across the other agents, their rifles, their vehicles with their blinking lights. Finally, he looked at me, a deep look of profound sorrow, a look that spanned 52 years of shared silence. The message was no longer a question, it was an answer, an indictment. "This thing," the gesture said, "is from up there. It is why we are here. And you," he indicated the agents and their technology, "are the reason we have stayed hidden." They weren't survivors of a simple crash. They were refugees. They were hiding not from humanity, but from human nature. They were hiding from what we would inevitably become if we ever got our hands on their technology. They had seen our capacity for violence in our simplest tools and knew what we would do with their greatest ones. I held my breath, waiting for the crack of a rifle shot that would tear my world apart. The agents were screaming into their radios, a jumble of panicked code words and terrified shouts. But Miller was silent. He hadn't moved. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. It was with a sudden, dawning comprehension. He slowly, deliberately lowered his weapon. He looked from the towering, sorrowful creature to me, an old man weeping silently in his boots, and then back to the softly glowing technology held in the Bigfoot's open hand. He saw it. He saw the whole picture in that one terrible moment. The creature wasn't a threat. The technology was. And giving that technology to the men behind him, to the generals and politicians, would be like giving a lit match to a child in a house made of gasoline. The final confrontation wasn't with guns or monsters, it was with one man's conscience. He raised his radio to his lips. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly flat, devoid of all emotion, the voice of a man making a report he would have to live with for the rest of his life. "Miller here," he said, the words cutting through the panicked chatter. "Source of the signal has been located and identified. It's a defunct agricultural deep well pump. There's severe magnetic interference from the iron content in the bedrock. It's a dead end. We're clear. Pack it up." A stunned silence fell over the yard. The other agents looked at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "You heard me," Miller said, his voice like stone. "This is a geological anomaly. There is nothing here. Our job is done." He covered for us. In that moment, the man from Homeland Security, the man I saw as the end of everything, became our only hope. He chose to see a family instead of a weapon. Miller walked over to me, his face a mask. He didn't look at the Guardian, who still stood there, the rock still humming in his hand. He looked only at me. "The signal needs to stop, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a low whisper only I could hear. "Permanently." I understood. This was the price. I turned and walked slowly toward the Guardian, my old legs trembling. He watched me approach, his dark eyes full of a wisdom I was only just beginning to comprehend. I reached out my hands. He hesitated for a second. Then gently, so gently, he placed the cool, humming weight of the rock into my palms. It felt like holding a dying star. I turned and walked back to Miller, my only proof, my only physical link to their entire existence, held out in my hands. I placed it in his. I traded the heart of my secret for their continued existence. He took it without a word, his expression unreadable, and walked back to his car. They were gone by morning. The entire family. There was no sound, no final goodbye. The offering bucket sat by the porch, full and untouched. The woods were silent again, but it was a new kind of silence, an empty silence, a hollow silence that echoed the one in my own chest. I went to the barn, the door still slightly ajar. The air inside was cold and empty, the familiar musk of their presence already fading. The carved calendar on the beams felt like a forgotten language. But on the outside of the heavy barn door, there was one last carving, fresh and new. It wasn't a pattern or a symbol. It was a map, a star map, intricate and precise, showing a path from our sun to a distant, unknown constellation, a map home. It was their last gift, a thank you, a goodbye, and a final, silent plea for me to keep their secret, a secret that was now, truly and completely, all mine. Now, all I have is the silence and the memory of that day. My life is back to what it was before that winter in Croix 71, the squeak of my boots on the floorboards, the groan of the wind through the pines. But the silence is different now. It's not the silence of grief. It's the silence of a promise kept. The government didn't come to my farm to destroy a monster. They came seeking a weapon, and in the end, a man in a suit, a single man in the vast machinery of power, made a choice. He saw what they were so afraid of. He saw us. That's the truth that's been crushing me. The deepest truth is that we are the monster we've been looking for all along. Our endless hunger for power, for dominance, for the next great weapon, is the real beast in the woods, and sometimes the most human act imaginable is to lie, to look truth in the eye and bury it, for the good of everyone. This is my confession, the end of my story and theirs. The weight is yours now, too. You know why they hide. You know what happened in the heart of Montana when humanity came face to face with a truth it wasn't ready for. All I ask is that you remember it. Remember that there are still secrets in this world worth protecting, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to let something remain unknown. Thank you for listening to an old man's final words. If this story has touched you, if you believe in the promise I kept, please show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel for more stories like this, and sharing this confession with others who need to hear it. And please, stick around. The next story appearing on your screen is one I think you'll find just as unforgettable. Thank you. Soft, ambient music fades in and plays out.